15 years ago, a teenage girl named Becca Orlovsky stepped into the sky and exploded. The resulting shockwave, known as the Cascade, encircled the globe, giving 99% of every human being on the planet a superpower. The fallout of B-Day was swift. Bodies began to change. People became lighter, then floated off the ground entirely. Others grew fur and fangs, losing their minds and their humanity. Some gained strength, some speed. Some became intangible and fell straight to the Earth's core, and others faded from existence, never to be seen again. In the course of a few weeks, societies crumbled, governments splintered, and chaos reigned. But humanity endured. We adapted, and soon, we began to rebuild. Hello, and welcome to the phone booth. I'm your host, Joe Pollard. If you've never listened to the show before, we suggest you go back to the beginning and proceed in order. But if you like a standalone story and want to start with this episode, we welcome you. If you would like to support the show, become a patron at www.patreon.com/foolsgallery. So check us out, give what you can, and thank you for your support. Today, we find ourselves in Burlington, Vermont, a city that has changed drastically since B-Day. What was once a quaint little town has become the capital of one of the most stable countries in the world, the United States of New England. Nestled next to the beautiful Lake Champlain, Burlington has become a hub of political and military power, respected and feared across the splintered continental America. The subject of today's episode is believed to be the main reason why. Despite being one of the most photographed human beings on the planet, Bishop Cline has a forgettable face. Even when you're staring straight at it, it slips through your mind like sand through fingers. He does not look like a superpowered commando or an arbiter of peace. He does not look like an idealistic leader or a fascistic dictator. In fact, Bishop Cline looks nothing like the many disparate ways he's been described. He looks, invariably, like a normal guy. I like boats. When I die, there's going to be a conversation about what to write on my tombstone. Hero, leader, fascist, world's worst president. But my vote's pretty simple. Here lies Bishop Cline. He liked boats. I was an only child. Not the weird kind who only gets love and attention from parents who'd be better served with a cat. No. I was the mistake that convinced my parents to stop having kids. I can't remember a dinner that wasn't silent. Just three strangers sitting around a table, trying to find a good enough excuse not to live together. It was a small house, smaller every day I grew up. When I turned 14, there didn't seem to be enough space for the three of us, so I tried to escape. Ran away a few times, but always came back. Vermont, even before B-Day, is not a place you want to be homeless. Even when it's warm, winter's right around the corner. On one doomed runaway, I walked past the Lake Champlain marina. I always liked the marina. Used to spend entire days there just watching the boats bump up against the dock, straining ever so slightly against their bindings. But on that day, I saw something new. It was an old, beat-up sailboat lying in the grass out front. Used to be a real pisser of a ship, sleek and proud, but rot had crept its way through her hull. Something had snapped the mast in half, and on her side, in messy, splattered paint, was the word, free. There was something about that old wreck that just held me. She had an air of ancient majesty that conjured a beautiful image in my mind. I asked one of the dock workers for his help. He grabbed his truck, and we carted her home. My parents always reacted the same when I ran away. Hopeful when I left, disappointed when I came back. But when I returned with a boat in tow, they were so shocked they didn't even argue when I moved her into the garage. We never talked about why they didn't stop me. But I always thought it was for the same reason that I got the boat in the first place. It was an excuse for us not to speak to one another. I think it worked out for everyone. The next morning I got to work. Barely knew what I was doing, but I was good with my hands, and progress wasn't the goal. I lost myself in the boat. Everything fell away but the burn in my muscles, the ache in my back, the sweat on my brow. For about half a year, I worked alone, making little progress, but it kept me out of the house. But then, God threw us a sucker punch when he killed my Aunt Cecilia down in Boston. I didn't go to the funeral. Had to haggle some sail fabric down a couple $100. And anyway, I didn't even know Cecilia. Got home that night expecting the same dark, quiet, familiar house. Kinda threw me for a loop when I heard laughter coming from the kitchen. You didn't grow up with my folks, so you don't know, but laughter wasn't an ordinary sound in my house. Didn't know what to make of it, really. Kitchen smelled wonderful, too, like baked bread and family, and there was a boy sitting in my chair. He had this great big smile on his face, and he was laughing. My cousin Charlie had come to live with us. We were the same age, Charlie and me, but were about as similar as night and day. He smiled when I scowled, was slight where I was heavy set, and boy did my parents love him. He was the son they never had, where I was just a tenant who didn't pay rent and they couldn't evict. That dinner was the first in memory without a single drop of silence. Charlie had a way of bridging the gaps between conversations. The dark shadows of my parents' frowns seemed to shrink away from him, leaving behind a warm feeling that I can only describe as homey. I didn't like it. Charlie, he unsettled me. Nobody should be that happy, especially after his mother's funeral. So I excused myself and went up to my room. That night, after I was sure everyone had gone to bed, I nipped down to the garage to relax. The boat always calmed me down. But when I got there, I found Charlie curled up inside her hull, his face puffy and red. I almost clocked him. Little shit was in my boat. But instead, I rapped my knuckles on her side and told him to move. With all the dignity left to him, he picked himself up and hopped out, plopping down on my workbench, sniffling the whole way. I watched him go, making sure he didn't scuff the paint. Then I got to work, doing my best to ignore him. But Charlie was not an easy guy to ignore. Always talking, always asking questions. He asked if I had a name for her. I didn't. He asked if I knew how to sail. I didn't. He asked why I was fixing up a sailboat if I couldn't sail. I told him to shut up or leave. We fell into silence. Hypnotized by my movements, he watched. After a minute or an hour, I looked over. He was asleep, his breath working in unison with my sanding. Next morning, I woke inside the boat as I had 1,000 times. Charlie was gone. I had no idea where he got off to, but didn't really think about it. Work to be done, after all. Forgot all about him until the garage door banged open a few hours later. He tottered in, almost collapsing under a tower of books, his tiny arms shaking under the weight. With a loud whoomp, he dropped the books on the workbench. Then, shooting a smile and a shrug my way, he opened the top book. The Fundamentals of Sailing, I think it was called. And he began to read. Didn't know what to make of that, so I went back to work, thinking for the first time about what I would do when I finished. We worked like that for hours, days, and months. The world kept at bay. Me covered in sweat, hammering, sanding, sawing. Charlie reading, learning to sail. Like a tumor, he grew on me. Got so bad I couldn't work if he wasn't there. One day he got sick and I couldn't focus. Had to call it a day and go up to his room. But something else had changed. For the first time, I had a goal. For the first time, I was working towards something. We were going to use the boat to find Champ. Now, Joey, I'm sure an educated boy like you knows all about Champ. But just on the off chance your listeners aren't as cultured as you or I, let me explain. Ever since Ethan Allen dragged cannons to Fort Ticonderoga in the Revolution, there have been stories about Champ, the lake monster that lives in Lake Champlain just off the coast of Burlington. 15-foot sea serpent, never been seen but a few hazy photos. Supposed to have lived in the lake since the Middle Triassic period or something. Long neck, little body. She's a damn legend. And damn was Charlie obsessed with her. Had this dog-eared book, Fabled Beasts of Legend, or Fantasy Fables and Fabrications. Shit, I can't remember. Anyway, it took you through all the mythological beasts people had seen over the years. Bigfoot, the abominable snowman, the Yeti, Loch Ness Monster. But it was Champ that caught us. Charlie was convinced she was swimming just offshore, waiting to be found. He would read passages to me from the book, write and perform poetry. He even wanted to name the boat after Champ. I rejected that one out of hand. I already had a name picked out. But with Champ as our goal, the work sped by, and sooner than I ever expected she was seaworthy. Most beautiful thing I've ever seen, sleek and regal, her mast rising skyward in an almost defiant manner. White bodies, sky blue sail, just as I had pictured her on that first day. It was a chipper autumn morning when we rolled her out to the lake. I spent the night before painting a name on her hull while Charlie slept. Had it covered with a cloth. He kept trying to sneak a peek, but he was a little shit and easy to toss around. It was a very solemn occasion. Felt like the most important moment of our lives. Charlie read a poem. Real bad, but felt right. Then it was time for the christening. In a deep voice that wasn't his own, Charlie asked me to reveal her name. Hesitantly, I removed the cloth. Charlie's voice caught. I couldn't meet his eyes. I was never really comfortable with that sort of thing. We broke the bottle on her hull, and then together, we pushed Cecilia into the calm morning waters of Lake Champlain. We didn't find Champ that day. Didn't find her for the next 15 years either. But we were out there, every weekend of the summer with binoculars, a cooler full of beer, and each other. The years passed. Charlie became a local politician, state rep with eyes on the governor's seat. Smooth talking, good looking and smart as he was, it didn't seem like a pipe dream. I worked in the marina fixing up boats, both happy, both busy. But no matter what we were doing, every weekend we'd escape out into the water, looking for Champ. The world kept at bay. But sometimes, the world comes looking for you. B-Day started calm, beautiful, and sunny. Didn't stay that way. The cascade came for us like it came for everyone. Its freaky pink dust sweeping over the trees and onto the lake, the waves fleeing before it. The dust caught our sail, twisting Cecilia around and nearly throwing Charlie and me into the churning water. Slowly, the lake calmed, and for a moment, I thought the worst had passed. Then a giant fireball erupted from the city. Bodies began to float into the air, their screams distant and lonely in the early morning breeze. Without a word, Charlie spun the rudder east. Our sail caught wind and we hightailed it back to the city. The wind was with us, Cecilia sang with pleasure as we sped forward. Then we hit a wave, hard. Threw Cecilia off course and knocked me on my ass. Something was wrong. For some reason, we were carrying too much weight. Didn't make any sense. That is until I tried to stand and couldn't. My body, too heavy to lift. I couldn't move. Couldn't even raise my hand. The weight was in my bones, dragging me down from the inside. I screamed and Charlie pulled up on the sail. Cecilia tilted and picked up speed. Helpless, I lay on the deck, unable to move, not knowing how close we were to land. A resounding crack was my answer as Charlie ran us aground. The crash threw Charlie from the boat. I tried to reach for him but couldn't raise my hand. Cecilia shuddered and groaned, then screeched in pain as she tipped over, dropping me into the shallows. I was able to raise my head just enough to see my beautiful boat splinter, drift to her side, and lie still. Charlie lay feet from me, blood leaking from a head wound. I tried to rise. Strength came from somewhere and I stood. I felt dense, like a bowling ball. As I straightened, my back cracked with loud metallic clicks. I had no idea what that meant, But super strength and metal bones are never the first thing you think of. I moved to Charlie. He looked frail and small, like the kid crying in my half-finished boat. Even then, I knew I had changed and he hadn't. I picked him up, light as a feather, fragile as a baby, and carried him off into the city, towards safety. But Burlington wasn't Burlington, and safety was nowhere to be found. We passed a riot at the college, and every freaking lamppost, phone, and flagpole had some floating sap clinging to it, their feet pulling them into the sky. Charlie was coming to when I heard a scream. I looked up, and there, sprinting towards us, its mouth lathered in foam and blood, was a monster. Nearly 8 feet tall, covered in fur, a long snout brimming with sharp, blood-stained teeth that charged me. Arms long as pool cues, ending in gleaming claws, slashed downwards. I dropped Charlie and raised my hand in defense. The claws cut deep, nearly 6 inches long. They should have shorn my arm clean off. But they hit bone, and my bones don't break. A loud metal clang reverberated through the city. The beast cried out in pain as its claws snapped. Without thinking, I grabbed it by the arm, pulled myself into its body, and slammed my fist into its guts. I felt bones splinter and organs burst. Its body went limp as it fell to the ground. Whimpering in pain, it tried to drag itself away from me. I fell to my knees, unable to give chase. Blood gushed from my arm, almost covering the glint of steel at its center. It took me a moment to realize it was my bone. I couldn't understand that. Couldn't wrap my brain around it. All I knew was that I was on the ground, bleeding, and that Charlie was there, talking to me, telling me to get up. I must have listened, because the next thing I knew, I was waking up in the dark lobby of an office building. It was night. A single streetlight flickering through a smashed window illuminated Charlie. He sat there, staring out into the street, facing the world I wasn't ready for. Still groggy from blood loss, I moved to him. He didn't look up, so I followed his gaze and caught my breath. They filled the streets. Each beast a different shape, a different animal, a different set of deadly weapons, each one their own unique nightmare. I could only imagine where they had come from. Aliens and werewolves were my best guess. But luckily, I had Charlie. He pointed towards 2 beasts creeping past us, one covered in scales, the other looking like a freaking kangaroo. They stopped at a crosswalk. It was the strangest thing, almost like they were waiting for something. Then I saw it. The crosswalk signal was still working, and the bright orange hand shone clear in the night. The hand gave way to the walking man, and the 2 beasts stalked across the street. "They're human," Charlie said, stuck between wonder and disgust. You could tell in the way they moved, the way they interacted with each other. Hell, I saw one holding a door for another. Minds were gone, given way to animal instinct, but not even an act of God can erase muscle memory. I turned to Charlie, waiting. He had a plan. I knew it. He always had a plan. And I have to say, in that moment, I needed one. The world had ended. There didn't seem to be a next step. I needed Charlie to give me a plan. And he did. Just like always. There are names that stand the test of time. George Washington, Julius Caesar, Beck Orlovsky, Bishop Cline. These names, for better or worse, extend beyond their owners' short lives, affecting us, changing us to this day. And then, there are the other names. Names like mine. Names like yours. Names that will eventually fade as memory does until they are gone entirely. Names like Charlie Weiss. There are no murals built to him, no books bearing his name. No one who seems to remember his life or the effect he had on us all. Charlie is in the records, however, a name mentioned and then forgotten in USNE history classes, a footnote in his cousin's great story. And yet, I find it odd that in Bishop's retelling, it is not his plan that creates a nation, but Charlie's, the man forgotten. To understand that plan and to hear of its ramifications, both intentional and not, check back in next week, where we wrap up Bishop and Charlie's story in Champ, Part 2.